The conference room on the 42nd floor of downtown Houston's most expensive office tower fell silent as three men in $1,000 suits slid a single sheet of paper across the mahogany table. Miguel Reyes, the man who'd co-founded the company sitting in that very room, stared at the document for a long moment before looking up at the faces of his business partners. Men he'd trusted, men he'd worked alongside for 7 years, men he'd called friends. The paper was simple. A buyout offer. $50,000 for his third of a company now valued at $12 million. Before we dive into what happened next, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because this story of betrayal and silent revenge is about to show you why you should never underestimate the person you're trying to destroy. What you're about to hear isn't just another rags to riches story. This is the account of how one man, dismissed and humiliated by the very people who'd built their success on his back, methodically constructed an empire that would eventually swallow theirs whole. This is about Miguel Reyes, a name that today commands respect across 20 American states, controlling one of the largest independent logistics networks in the Southwest. But in that conference room in 2009, as the financial crisis ravaged the economy, he was just another immigrant being told his contribution didn't matter anymore. This is the story of how the American dream died for one man, and how he built something even greater from its ashes. Miguel Reyes arrived in Texas in 1995 with $300 in his pocket, a fourth-grade education from a rural Mexican village, and something his future betrayers would fatally underestimate: an unbreakable work ethic forged in the unforgiving fields of Zacatecas. While his soon-to-be partners, Brandon Mitchell, James Keller, and David Hartman, were finishing their business degrees at UT Austin, Miguel was working 18-hour days as a warehouse loader, learning the logistics business from the ground up, understanding every inefficiency, every wasted mile, every gap in the system that college textbooks never taught. He learned English by listening to truckers on CB radios during overnight shifts. He studied route optimization by watching which drivers returned earliest. He understood the business not through spreadsheets and case studies, but through sweat, observation, and an almost supernatural ability to see patterns others missed. By 2002, when he finally saved enough to buy his first semi-truck, a beat-up Freightliner with 300,000 miles already on it, Miguel had knowledge that his future Ivy League partners would never possess. He understood logistics not as a business model, but as a living, breathing ecosystem. The partnership began almost accidentally in 2003. Brandon Mitchell, fresh out of his MBA program and full of ambitious plans for a regional trucking startup, met Miguel at a fuel stop outside San Antonio. Miguel's truck had broken down, and while he waited for a tow, he overheard Brandon complaining to his partners about finding reliable drivers who understood both the Mexican and American sides of cross-border logistics. Miguel introduced himself, and within 30 minutes of conversation, he'd identified 17 critical flaws in Brandon's business plan. The young MBAs were stunned. Here was this immigrant trucker with calloused hands and broken English, dissecting their carefully researched strategy with surgical precision. By the end of the week, they'd made Miguel an offer: become their operations partner, bring his truck and his knowledge, take a third of the company. Miguel agreed, but insisted on one thing: everything in writing, everything legal, everything equal. They laughed at his caution, called him hermano, told him they were family now. He signed the papers anyway. For 7 years, Miguel built the foundation of what would become trans-state logistics, while Brandon, James, and David worked the corporate side, pitching clients, securing contracts, managing finances. Miguel ran operations with an almost mystical efficiency. He recruited drivers from the immigrant community, men and women others dismissed, but who Miguel knew possessed unmatched reliability and work ethic. He negotiated maintenance contracts that saved the company hundreds of thousands. He designed route systems that reduced fuel costs by 30%. The company grew from 3 trucks to 47. Revenue climbed from nothing to $12 million annually. And through it all, Miguel remained in the background, the operations guy, the one who handled the trucks, while his partners wore the suits and took the credit at industry conferences. They introduced him to potential clients with subtle condescension. "This is Miguel. He keeps our wheels turning," always with that patronizing smile that suggested he was necessary but not quite equal, valuable but not quite respected. The cracks began showing in 2008 when Miguel proposed an aggressive expansion strategy into the Texas-California corridor. He'd spent months analyzing the market, identifying an opportunity in specialized agricultural transport that their competitors were ignoring. But Brandon, James, and David dismissed it immediately. "Stick to what you know, buddy," James told him during a partners meeting, his voice dripping with barely concealed disdain. "We handle strategy. You handle the trucks." Miguel Noticed how they'd started excluding him from major decisions, how board meetings happened without him, how his suggestions were noted and ignored while their ideas, often inferior versions of what he'd proposed months earlier, were implemented with fanfare. He noticed how they'd started referring to themselves as the founders in press releases, how Miguel's name appeared smaller and smaller in company materials, how new employees didn't even know he was a partner. The disrespect was systematic, deliberate, designed to erase him while keeping his operational genius captive. Then came September 2009, and the meeting that would change everything. The financial crisis had battered their industry, but Transstate was surviving, largely because Miguel's ruthlessly efficient operations kept them profitable when larger competitors were failing. But Brandon, James, and David saw opportunity in chaos. They'd found investors willing to buy into the company, but only if they could streamline the ownership structure. The offer they slid across that table wasn't just insulting in its amount. It was calculated, timed precisely when they knew Miguel was stretched thin financially, supporting his extended family, caring for his sick mother. $50,000 for a third of a $12 million company. Take it, they told him, or we'll make things difficult. They had the lawyers, the connections, the understanding of American business law that Miguel lacked. They had him trapped, or so they thought. You've been a valuable employee, Brandon said, and the choice of word, employee, not partner, hung in the air like poison. But let's be honest, Miguel. This company succeeded because of our business acumen, our connections, our education. You drove trucks, you managed logistics. That's important, sure, but it's not the same as building a company. We're offering you more than fair compensation for your contribution. The other two nodded, their faces masks of practiced sympathy hiding the smugness underneath. James leaned forward. Think about it, man. 50 grand? That's life-changing money for someone from your background. You could buy a house, help your family. Why fight us on this? You don't have the resources for a legal battle, and honestly, the paperwork might show some irregularities in how your original stake was structured. We'd hate for immigration to start asking questions about work visas from back in '03. The threat was veiled but unmistakable. Miguel sat perfectly still, his weathered hands flat on the table, his face unreadable. The silence stretched for 30 seconds. 45. A full minute. The tension in that room was suffocating. Finally he spoke, his English slow and measured but perfectly clear. You believe you built this company with your degrees and your connections. You believe I was just the man who drove the trucks. You believe I don't understand business, that I don't understand American law, that I don't understand what you're really offering me. He paused, and for the first time something flickered in his eyes that made Brandon shift uncomfortably in his chair. I will take your offer. I will sign your papers. But I want you to remember this moment. Remember how certain you are right now. Remember how smart you feel. He stood, picked up the pen they'd provided, and signed. The three partners exhaled in relief, already mentally spending the millions they'd just stolen. Miguel walked out of that office carrying a check for $50,000 and something infinitely more valuable. Absolute clarity about who these men really were. What his former partners didn't know, what they couldn't know, because they'd never bothered to truly see him, was that Miguel had been preparing for this moment for 2 years. He'd watched them, learned from their methods while recognizing their fatal flaws. They saw business as a game of appearances and connections, of who you knew and how you looked on paper. Miguel understood it as something older and more fundamental. Logistics, efficiency, relationships built on respect and reliability. The network he'd built among immigrant drivers, warehouse workers, and small business owners across the Southwest wasn't just an operational asset. It was a community, bound by trust and mutual respect, by the understanding that they'd all been underestimated and dismissed by people exactly like Brandon, James, and David. While his former partners had been playing golf with potential investors, Miguel had been building something they couldn't see and wouldn't value until it was too late. An army of people who would follow him anywhere because he'd treated them not as resources, but as human beings. Within 3 months of leaving Transstate, Miguel had done the impossible. Using the $50,000 as seed capital, leveraging every relationship he'd built, calling in favors from drivers who remembered how he'd helped them when no one else would, he assembled a fleet of 8 trucks. Not by buying them, he couldn't afford that, but through creative partnerships where drivers owned their vehicles and Miguel provided the contracts, the routes, the system. He called it Reyes Logistics, And he ran it from a converted garage in a working-class neighborhood his former partners wouldn't have dared to visit. He worked 20-hour days, sleeping 4 hours a night on a cot in the corner of his makeshift office. Every dollar the company made went back into expansion. Every driver he recruited was someone the traditional companies had overlooked. Immigrants, women, veterans with PTSD, ex-convicts trying to rebuild their lives, people who'd been dismissed, underestimated, told they weren't good enough. Miguel built his empire from the island of misfit toys, and he built it with a revolutionary promise: respect, fair pay, and a path to ownership for anyone willing to work for it. The first year was brutal. Transstate, now flush with investor money, used their resources to undercut Reyes Logistics on contracts, spread rumors about Miguel's reliability, pressured shared clients to choose between them. Brandon made sure everyone in the industry knew that Miguel was a disgruntled former employee who'd been fairly compensated for his stake. Industry publications ran stories about Transstate's expansion that painted Miguel as an ungrateful hanger-on who'd tried to claim credit for his better's work. The three partners were certain they'd buried him. They celebrated their victory at the industry conference in Phoenix, giving interviews about their innovative business model and their plans to expand into California, the exact strategy Miguel had proposed years earlier. But while they were giving speeches and accepting awards, something was happening in the shadows of the logistics world that they completely missed. Small clients, the ones who actually moved goods rather than just managing them, were quietly switching to Reyes Logistics, not because of price, Miguel couldn't compete there, but because of something Transstate had forgotten how to provide: service, reliability, and the feeling that someone actually gave a damn about getting their freight where it needed to be. By year 3, Reyes Logistics had expanded to 35 trucks and had established routes through Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California. Miguel had done what his former partners said was impossible. He'd built a competitive logistics company without their connections, without their investors, without their business school pedigree. He'd done it through something simpler and more powerful. He'd built a company that actually worked. His drivers stayed because they were treated with dignity. His clients stayed because their freight arrived on time, every time, with no excuses. His reputation grew not through press releases and conference speeches, but through the oldest and most reliable form of marketing: word of mouth from people who'd actually used the service. And all the while, Miguel watched Transstate with the focused attention of a man who hasn't forgotten. He tracked their expansions, their vulnerabilities, their increasing reliance on investor capital to fund growth that wasn't translating to profitability. He watched them make the classic mistake of appearance over substance, growth over efficiency, ego over execution. The confrontation Miguel had been waiting for came in 2015 at an industry networking event in Dallas. 6 years had passed since the boardroom betrayal. Brandon spotted Miguel across the room and couldn't resist approaching, emboldened by bourbon and ego. "Miguel, I heard you were still around, doing your little trucking thing. That's good, man. Good for you." His voice carried that same patronizing tone, that same assumption of superiority. James and David joined him, and the three of them formed a wall of expensive suits and barely concealed contempt. "We're at 120 trucks now," James bragged. "3 regional hubs. We're in talks with a Fortune 500 for a major contract. How many trucks you running these days?" 20. 30. The crowd around them grew silent, sensing confrontation. Miguel stood there, shorter than all 3 of them, wearing a simple button-down shirt and jeans, his face weathered by years of work they couldn't imagine. He could have walked away. Should have walked away, maybe. Instead, he smiled. 47, Miguel said quietly. The same number Transstate had when they'd forced him out. The irony wasn't lost on anyone listening. Brandon laughed, but it sounded forced. "Well, you've done okay then. Honestly, I'm impressed you've survived this long. Most guys in your position would have given up, gone back to driving for someone else. Takes guts to keep fighting when you're that far behind." The casual cruelty of it. The assumption that Miguel was struggling while they thrived. The smug certainty that they'd won. It rippled through the crowd. Several people shifted uncomfortably. One woman, a young logistics manager, looked openly disgusted, but Miguel's expression never changed. He simply nodded, as if accepting a truth, and that somehow made Brandon angrier. "You know what your problem is, Miguel? You never understood that this business isn't about the trucks. It's about relationships. It's about credibility. It's about having the education and the pedigree that opens doors. You can be the best driver in the world, but you'll never be more than that. That's just how it is." The words hung in the air. And in that moment, Miguel made his decision. Not to defend himself, he was long past needing these men's approval, but to teach a lesson that was long overdue. "You're right," he said, his voice still quiet but carrying to every corner of the suddenly silent room. "This business is about relationships. It's about credibility. Let me ask you something, Brandon. How is your credibility? With Horizon Manufacturing? With Southwest Agricultural? With Rio Grande Distribution?" He rattled off names, and with each one Brandon's face grew slightly paler. "These were major clients, cornerstone accounts for Trans-State. Because I have relationships with all of them now. They came to me. They came to Reyes Logistics because they were tired of your innovative business model that meant late deliveries, damaged goods, and customer service representatives who treated them like they were lucky to have your attention. They came to me because I give them what you never could, respect and reliability." David stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "That's bullshit. You're stealing our clients with some kind of immigrant sob story, playing the victim." But Miguel cut him off with a gesture, nothing dramatic. Just a slight raising of his hand, but the authority in it stopped David cold. "I didn't steal anything. They left you. There's a difference. Just like I didn't steal your business model when you pushed me out. I built something better, something you don't understand because you never did the work. You managed spreadsheets, I moved freight. You impressed investors, I impressed clients. You built a company that looks successful. I built a company that is successful." The crowd was watching now with rapt attention. Several people had their phones out, recording. This wasn't just a confrontation. It was a referendum on everything the industry celebrated versus everything it actually needed. "And yes, I have 47 trucks. The same number you had when you thought you'd buried me. But what you don't know is what I've done with those 47 trucks. What I've built that you can't see because you never learned to look." James tried to regain control of the conversation, his voice sharp with defensive anger. "Listen, we gave you a fair offer. You were compensated. If you've got some grudge because you weren't good enough to stay in the big leagues." But Miguel's next words cut through the bluster like a blade. "I have contracts in 20 states now. Arizona, California, Colorado, Florida, Georgia, Idaho, Kansas, Louisiana, Missouri, Montana, Nebraska, Nevada, New Mexico, North Carolina, Oklahoma, Oregon, Tennessee, Texas, Washington, and Wyoming. 20 states with 47 trucks. You have 3 states with 120 trucks. I move more freight with better efficiency, higher customer satisfaction, and better profit margins than you've ever achieved. How is that possible, do you think? With my 4th grade education and my immigrant sob story?" The silence in that room was deafening. People were doing the math in their heads. What Miguel was describing shouldn't be possible. It violated everything they'd learned in business school about economies of scale and resource allocation. Brandon's face had gone from pale to red, anger and humiliation battling for dominance. "You're lying. There's no way." Miguel pulled out. His phone pulled up a document and held it up for anyone close enough to see. It was a satisfaction survey from an independent logistics auditor, the kind major corporations use to evaluate carriers. Reyes Logistics, 4.8 out of 5. Trans-State Logistics, 3.2 out of 5. "I'm not lying, I'm just better at this than you are. I always was, you knew it too, deep down. That's why you forced me out. Not because I wasn't valuable, but because I was too valuable and you couldn't stand that the immigrant trucker understood the business better than the men with MBA degrees. You couldn't stand that clients respected me more than they respected you. So you took what you could from me and tried to erase the rest. But you made one mistake. You thought the business was about you. It was never about you. It was about the work. And I never stopped doing the work." The tension had shifted now. What started as a confrontation where 3 successful businessmen mocked a struggling underdog had inverted into something else entirely. 3 men realizing they'd been operating under a fundamental misconception. A woman in the crowd, the logistics manager who'd looked disgusted earlier, spoke up. "I've heard about Reyes Logistics. Everyone in the Southwest has. They're the ones you call when you absolutely need it there on time. They're the ones who treat drivers like human beings instead of disposable assets. If what he's saying is true..." Brandon whirled on her, but Miguel continued. "Relentless now. It is true. And here's what else is true. Trans-State is failing. Your investor money is running out. Your growth was unsustainable. Your efficiency metrics are terrible. You're hemorrhaging clients because you spent more time learning how to look successful than how to be successful. You're going to face a major decision in the next 6 months. Sell to a larger company and lose everything you built, or find someone who can actually fix your operations before you collapse." Completely. How did Miguel know this? How could he know this? The answer was simple but devastating. Because Miguel had never stopped watching, never stopped learning, never stopped building relationships with the people who actually made the industry work. Drivers talked. Warehouse workers talked. Clients talked. While Brandon, James, and David had been playing the game of corporate theater, Miguel had been living in the real world, the one where reputations were built on truth rather than press releases. And that real world had told him everything. Trans-State's California expansion had been a disaster, plagued by inefficiency and mismanagement. Their Fortune 500 contract was vaporware, negotiations that would never close because their operational capabilities couldn't match their promises. Their investors were getting nervous, asking hard questions about profitability that Brandon, James, and David couldn't answer. Trans-State Logistics was a house of cards built on a foundation of stolen credibility, and Miguel had watched it teetering for 2 years, waiting for this moment. "You're bitter," David said, but his voice had lost its edge. He sounded desperate now, searching for any explanation that didn't force him to confront the truth. "You're bitter because we succeeded without you, and you can't accept that we were right to remove you from—" Miguel's laugh cut him off. But it wasn't cruel. It was sad, tired, the sound of a man who'd carried something heavy for too long. "I'm not bitter, I'm grateful. You taught me something invaluable. You taught me that the American dream isn't about becoming like you. It's about building something better than you. Something based on respect, on dignity, on actual excellence rather than the performance of excellence. You gave me $50,000 and thought you'd won. I used that $50,000 to build something you could never create because you don't understand the fundamental truth of this business. People aren't resources to be exploited. They're partners to be respected. And that's why you're failing. That's why you'll always fail, no matter how much investor money you burn through." The confrontation could have ended there. Miguel had made his point, proved his worth, exposed their failures. But what came next was something nobody expected, least of all the 3 men who'd betrayed him. Miguel's voice softened, losing its edge of victory, becoming something else entirely, something that sounded like pity mixed with genuine sorrow. "Brandon, James, David, I don't want to see Trans-State fail. Not because I care about your egos or your reputations, but because there are good people working for you. Drivers who depend on those paychecks, warehouse workers with families, office staff who had nothing to do with what you did to me. When your company collapses, they're the ones who'll suffer, not you. You'll find investor money for your next venture. They'll be looking for work in a tight market." He paused, and the entire room seemed to hold its breath. "So I'm making you an offer. Not because you deserve it, but because they do. Reyes Logistics will acquire Trans-State. Your drivers, your staff, your clients, I'll take care of them. I'll fix your operations, honor your contracts, save your reputation. And you 3 will walk away with enough to save face but not enough to pretend you won." The shock that rippled through that room was electric. Brandon stammered, unable to form words. James's face had gone through denial, anger, and was landing somewhere in the territory of numb disbelief. David simply stared, as if Miguel had started speaking in an alien language. You're offering to buy us?" Brandon finally managed. "You can't afford that. You can't possibly—" But Miguel was already pulling up another document on his phone, this one a letter from a major bank outlining approved financing for an acquisition in the range of Trans-State's estimated value. "I can afford it because my company is profitable, because I built something sustainable, because banks understand that Reyes Logistics represents actual value, not just investor optimism. This offer is good for 72 hours. After that, I let you collapse on your own, and I'll pick up your clients anyway when they come looking for someone competent." The cruelty of it was exquisite precisely because it wasn't cruel at all. It was mercy dressed as business. Miguel was offering them salvation, but salvation that required them to admit everything they'd believed about themselves, about him, about the industry, had been fundamentally wrong. Brandon's eyes were wet now, whether from rage or humiliation or the crushing weight of realization, impossible to tell. "You did all this just to humiliate us? To prove some point about—" But Miguel shook his head, and for the first time, his expression showed genuine emotion. Disappointment, the kind a teacher might show a student who could have been better. "I did this to survive. To build something meaningful. To prove to myself that my dignity wasn't something you could buy for $50,000. Humiliating you is just a side effect. A bonus, maybe. But not the point. The point is that I'm giving you the chance to do the right thing now, even though you didn't do the right thing then. I'm giving your employees a future. I'm giving you a way to exit with some grace. That's more than you gave me. James, who'd been silent for several minutes, finally spoke, and his voice was hollow. Why? Why would you help us after what we did? Why not just let us burn? And Miguel's answer was the thing that broke them completely, that transformed this moment from confrontation to something approaching redemption. Because I'm not you. Because revenge is empty. Because the best way to defeat people who treated you as less than human is to remain human yourself. Because my mother taught me that carrying hate is like drinking poison and expecting your enemy to die. And because, and this is the part I need you to understand, I don't hate you. I pity you. You had everything: education, opportunity, capital, connections, and you used it all to build something hollow, something that crumbled the moment it faced real competition. I had nothing but my hands, my brain, and my willingness to work, and I built something that will outlast all of us. That's not victory. That's just what happens when you build on a foundation of truth, instead of lies. The silence that followed was the most profound thing anyone in that room had ever experienced. It wasn't the silence of shock or even humiliation. It was the silence of forced self-reflection, of everything you believed about yourself and the world being dismantled in real time. Brandon's face went through a series of changes. The collapse of ego, the confrontation with his own smallness, the realization that he'd become exactly the kind of person he'd claimed to be better than. David had tears running openly down his face now. Not tears of sadness, but of shame so profound it had become physical. James just stood there, his expensive suit somehow looking cheap, his polished exterior revealed as the costume it had always been. They were being unmade, not by cruelty, but by grace. The most devastating weapon of all. I'll send over the acquisition terms tomorrow, Miguel said quietly, his voice returning to business. You'll find them fair. More than fair, actually. I'm paying you more than your company is worth because I can afford to, and because I want you to live with that knowledge. I want you to know that the man you tried to destroy became successful enough to show you mercy you didn't earn. He started to walk away, then turned back one final time. One more thing. I have an open position. Operations manager. Someone to oversee our expansion into the southeast. It pays well, includes full benefits, opportunity for advancement based on merit. Brandon, you're good at sales, bad at operations, worse at respecting people. But you could learn, if you were willing to. The job is yours if you want it. If you can swallow your pride enough to work for the immigrant trucker you tried to erase. The offer hung in the air, impossible to accept, impossible to refuse, the ultimate test of whether any of them had learned anything from this catastrophic education in humility. Brandon's face was a war zone of competing emotions. Pride screamed at him to refuse, to storm out, to maintain some shred of dignity. But beneath that, something else was happening. The birth of actual self-awareness, painful as childbirth, necessary as breathing. He started, his voice cracking. I don't deserve that. I don't deserve any kindness from you. And Miguel's response was the thing that completed his transformation. No, you don't. But my mother, the one I was supporting when you forced me out, the one whose medical bills made your $50,000 bribe almost impossible to refuse. She taught me something. She said that dignity isn't something you can take from someone else. It's only something you can give away. You tried to take mine. You failed. And now I'm choosing to help you find yours, even though you tried to destroy it in me. That's not weakness. That's strength. That's what real power looks like. Not forcing people out of boardrooms, not stealing their work and calling it yours, but having the power to destroy someone and choosing to lift them up instead. The crowd that had gathered to watch a confrontation had witnessed something entirely different. A masterclass in the difference between success and significance, between winning and transcending the need to win. As Miguel walked away, people parted for him, not out of fear but out of respect. Real respect, earned not demanded. Behind him, Brandon stood frozen. David had sunk into a chair with his head in his hands, and James was openly crying. The facade he'd maintained for years, finally, completely shattered. Several people in the crowd were filming, and by the next morning, the confrontation would be industry legend. But for Miguel, walking out into the Dallas evening, breathing in the warm air, feeling the weight of 6 years of patient preparation and execution lifting from his shoulders, it wasn't about legend. It wasn't even about victory, really. It was about something simpler and more profound. He'd built something real. He'd done it with honor. And no one could take that from him ever again. 6 months later, Trans-State Logistics officially became a wholly owned subsidiary of Reyes Logistics. The acquisition was handled professionally, quietly, with dignity for everyone involved. Miguel kept his word. Every employee retained their position, most with better pay and benefits than they'd had before. The operational inefficiencies were fixed within 3 months. Client satisfaction scores soared. Brandon Mitchell accepted the position of operations manager, and though the first months were awkward, how could they not be? He proved willing to learn, to actually listen, to understand that the hierarchies he'd believed in were artificial, that talent and wisdom could come from anywhere, that education was no substitute for dedication and respect. David Hartman took a position in client relations, where his natural charisma could be deployed in service of actual excellence rather than hollow salesmanship. James Keller left the industry entirely, reportedly working in nonprofit management, trying to find some way to build something meaningful with what remained of his humbled life. Reyes Logistics continued its expansion, but always in the Miguel Reyes way. Sustainable growth based on real efficiency, respect for employees, and service that exceeded promises rather than falling short of them. By 2020, the company operated in 32 states with a fleet of over 300 trucks, but more importantly, it had become known throughout the industry as the place where the people others had given up on found second chances. Veterans with PTSD found patient understanding and accommodation. Ex-convicts found employers who believed in redemption. Immigrants found someone who spoke their language and understood their struggles. Women found an environment free from the harassment too common in the industry. Reyes Logistics wasn't just a trucking company, it had become a statement about what American business could be if it valued people as much as profits, dignity as much as dollars. The story of Miguel Reyes and his quiet triumph over the men who'd betrayed him spread beyond the logistics industry, becoming a parable told in business schools, though not always with the lesson Miguel would have wanted. Some saw it as a story of revenge. Others as proof that meritocracy works. But Miguel himself, when asked about it in a rare interview years later, had a different perspective. It's not about me winning. It's not about them losing. It's about what you build and why you build it. Those men built a company to impress people, to make money, to feel important. I built a company to move freight, to employ people with dignity, to prove to myself that my worth wasn't something they could vote on in a boardroom. They built on sand. I built on stone. The story isn't that I won. The story is that building on stone takes longer, hurts more, requires more of you, but it lasts. That's the only lesson worth learning. And maybe that's the real message here. The thing worth taking with you as you close this video and return to your own life with its own challenges and betrayals, and moments where you have to decide what kind of person you're going to be. Miguel Reyes wasn't special because he was smarter than his betrayers, or because he worked harder, though he was and did. He was special because when faced with the choice between becoming bitter or becoming better, between seeking revenge or building something meaningful, between proving his worth to people who'd never acknowledge it or proving it to himself and the people who mattered, he chose the harder path. Every time, without exception. And that choice, repeated over years, transformed not just his circumstances but his character, until he became the kind of person who could offer employment to the man who'd tried to destroy him. Not because it was strategically wise, but because it was morally right. You can't control what others do to you. Brandon, James, and David proved that. Sometimes people will betray you, dismiss you, try to erase your contributions and steal your dignity. Miguel couldn't control that. But what he could control, what he chose to control, was who he became in response. He became someone who built, someone who lifted others, someone who proved that the truest form of power isn't the ability to crush your enemies, but the wisdom to help them become better than they were, even when, especially when, they don't deserve it. That's not weakness. That's not being soft or naive. That's strength so profound, so complete, that it transforms everyone it touches, including the people who tried to hurt you. So if you're watching this from a place of hurt, from a moment where someone powerful made you feel small, from a situation where you've been dismissed or betrayed, or told you're not enough, remember Miguel Reyes. Remember that the person who tried to destroy you is often the person most afraid of what you might become. Remember that building something real, something based on excellence and dignity and respect, takes longer than building something fake, but it's the only thing that lasts. Remember that grace isn't weakness, forgiveness isn't surrender, and offering someone redemption doesn't mean you've forgotten what they did. It means you've become someone bigger than the hurt they caused. And remember that the sweetest victory isn't crushing your enemies, It's becoming so successful, so secure in your worth, so unshakably centered in your values, that you can afford to help them find theirs. If this story moved you, hit that like button, not for the algorithm, but as a commitment to yourself that you'll build on stone instead of sand, no matter how long it takes. Drop a comment telling us about a time someone underestimated you, or better yet, a time you chose grace over revenge and what you learned from it. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that their worth isn't determined by people who can't see it. And subscribe, because we're going to keep bringing you stories about real people who prove that character beats credentials, dignity beats dollars, and the long hard path of integrity ultimately beats the quick, easy path of compromise every single time. The world tries to tell us that winning means destroying your enemies. Miguel Reyes proved that real winning means becoming the kind of person who doesn't need enemies anymore. That's the victory worth pursuing. That's the legacy worth building. That's the life worth living.